Hello and welcome back to Study History with Mr. P. Now, as a follow-on to my video about crime, punishment and law enforcement in Anglo-Saxon England, I'm going to do the same thing but look at crime, punishment and law enforcement in Norman England in this video. So first of all, a summary of Norman rule. So the king's influence over the law increased. Just as it had done during Anglo-Saxon times, it increased even further under Norman kings, starting with William I. Punishment and law enforcement became more centralised, and there was an increased use of harsh punishments. William I used brutal force and extreme punishments, for example, to deal with Anglo-Saxon resistance and rebellions. Castles were built to control and intimidate the population, and Norman society was organised around the feudal system, which was different to the hierarchy that existed in Anglo-Saxon times. So under the feudal system, the king made the laws, owned all of the land and gave some to the nobles. The nobles, the wealthy and the powerful, were given land by the king, but in return they provided the king with soldiers and horses for the army. They gave some of their land to the knights. The knights lived on a small area of land and fought for the nobles and the king. The peasants or serfs had no land and they worked for the knights or the nobles and had no say in making laws. Now, under Norman rule, there was the murderum law. This stated that if a Norman was murdered by an Anglo-Saxon and the murderer wasn't captured and executed, there was a penalty, the murderum fine. It was paid by the hundreds. The area, the group of people living within the hundred that the body was found, had to pay this fine. So this is a development from the Wergild, where the fine for a murder was paid to a victim's family and was quite different in that a fine for the murder of a Norman was paid to the king if the murderer could not be found. William also introduced something called forest laws. He made large areas of land royal forests that he would use for hunting. This land didn't necessarily have to contain any forest, but it was known as royal hunting ground and royal land. Land used as common land was now controlled by the king, and it was illegal for most people then to hunt on or use this land, and in return punishments for breaking this law were harsh. So what were punishments and law enforcement like in Norman England? Well, physical punishments, fines and execution continued to be used as they had been in Anglo-Saxon times, but there was an increase in the number of crimes that were punishable by death or by mutilation. The Wergild came to an end, and fines were now paid directly to the king's officials, not the victims and their family. So we may have said that in Anglo-Saxon times, the Wergild was a form of retribution because the murderer physically paid money for their crime. But you would suggest that maybe in Norman times, whilst they did pay money for their crime, it went to the king, so it wasn't retribution as such for the crime. The law was also based on something called the King's Mund, the king's will. The idea that all people should be safe from crime and be able to live peacefully. Trial by ordeal did continue, but it did reduce during the medieval period, and trial by combat was introduced to settle disputes over land or money. Collective responsibility for preventing crime and catching suspects continued, as did the hue and cry for raising this as an issue in the first place.